Marcus lived in a small, rundown apartment on the edge of the city, in a neighborhood where the sidewalks were cracked, and the streetlights flickered uncertainly at night. The faded paint on the buildings told stories of better days long gone, and the hum of distant traffic mixed with the occasional bark of stray dogs. It wasn't a place anyone dreamed of living, but to Marcus, it was home. At just 10 years old, Marcus had already learned to carry burdens far beyond his years. Life had been harsh to him. He lost both his parents in a tragic car accident when he was barely old enough to understand the permanence of their absence. Since then, his grandmother, Miss Eleanor, had been his whole world. Miss Eleanor was a kind woman in her late 60s, her once vibrant energy dimmed by the toll of raising Marcus alone and the relentless grip of illness. She suffered from chronic arthritis that made her hands stiff and her steps slow, yet she always wore a gentle smile when she looked at Marcus, as if he were the light that kept her going. Marcus knew how hard life was for her, so he tried to make things easier. After school, he took odd jobs around the neighborhood, carrying groceries for elderly neighbors, sweeping floors at the corner store, and even helping at the local repair shop. The little money he earned went straight into a glass jar they kept on the kitchen counter, labeled bills and groceries. Their apartment was modest, with peeling wallpaper and a leaky faucet in the kitchen, but Marcus did his best to keep it clean and cozy for his grandma. He'd drape a warm blanket over her shoulders when the winter chills seeped in and surprise her with her favorite tea whenever he could afford it. On weekends, they'd sit together on their worn-out couch, Marcus reading aloud from old books they borrowed from the library. Every small act Marcus did carried a deep love for his grandmother. To him, she wasn't just family. She was his reason to try, his reason to smile despite everything. And though their life was difficult, Marcus held on to a quiet hope that one day things would get better for both of them. It was the last day of the year, and Marcus had just finished stacking shelves at the small corner store where he worked after school. The store's owner, Mr. Henderson, a gruff but kind-hearted man in his 60s, called Marcus over as he was putting on his jacket to leave. "You've done good this year, kid," Mr. Henderson said, handing Marcus a small envelope. "This is for you. Happy New Year." Marcus stared at the envelope, his eyes wide with surprise. He carefully opened it to find a crisp $20 bill inside. It wasn't much, but for Marcus, it felt like a fortune. "Thank you, sir." Marcus beamed, his face lighting up with gratitude. As he walked home through the chilly streets, Marcus clutched the bill tightly in his hand, his mind racing with possibilities. He could finally buy the new pair of gloves he'd been eyeing at the thrift store, or maybe some of his favorite snacks. But then another thought came to him, and it made his smile grow even wider. For years, Marcus and his grandma had celebrated New Year's Eve with whatever simple meal they could afford, usually bread, soup, or canned beans. But this year, he could do something different. He could treat his grandma to something special. He decided right then to spend the money on 2 hot, delicious meals from the diner down the street, a rare luxury for them. The thought of seeing his grandma's face light up as they shared a warm meal together filled his heart with excitement. Marcus felt a sense of pride, knowing that he could give her a small moment of joy to end the year on a brighter note. With his plan set, Marcus hurried home, the envelope now tucked safely in his pocket, and a smile that refused to fade. The icy wind cut through Marcus's thin jacket as he walked briskly down the dimly lit street, carrying the 2 warm takeout boxes in his hands. The savory aroma of the meals filled the air, and Marcus smiled at the thought of sharing them with his grandma. But as he rounded the corner near an old brick building, he came to an abrupt stop. There, huddled against the wall, was a man. His body was slumped over, arms wrapped tightly around himself, in a feeble attempt to fend off the biting cold. His clothes were ragged and layered, yet they offered little protection against the chill. A tattered beanie sat crooked on his head, and his shoes, worn down to the soles, barely clung to his feet. Marcus stood frozen, his gaze locked on the man's face. It was lined with deep creases, the kind that told stories of hardship and pain. His beard was scruffy, his skin weathered from years spent exposed to the elements. But it was his eyes that struck Marcus the most, dark, hollow, and lifeless, as though the man had long since given up on expecting anything better from the world. Marcus hesitated, his heart tugging at him. He thought of the 2 meals in his hands, the rare treat he'd been so eager to share with his grandma. Yet, standing in front of this man, Marcus couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest. The man didn't even look up. He simply sat there, as if too tired to care about anything anymore. Marcus swallowed hard, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. For a moment, he considered walking away. But then, he glanced at the meals in his hands and remembered his grandma's words. "We may not have much, Marcus, but we always have enough to share." He knelt down in front of the man, holding out one of the takeout boxes. The man's eyes flickered, slowly lifting to meet Marcus's. His gaze was filled with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Here," Marcus said softly, his voice steady but kind. "You need this more than I do." The man hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for the box. For a brief moment, their fingers brushed, and Marcus felt the roughness of the man's skin, a texture that spoke of years of struggle. The man opened the box, and the steam from the food rose, filling the cold air between them. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Instead, his eyes softened, and for the first time, there was a faint flicker of life in them. He looked at Marcus, nodding slightly, his expression one of quiet gratitude. Marcus smiled, standing back up. "Take care," he said, before turning and walking away. As he continued down the street, Marcus felt the chill a little less. The warmth of knowing he had done the right thing stayed with him, lighting up the dark night. The morning light crept through the thin curtains in Marcus's room, waking him from a restless sleep. He stretched, still feeling a quiet pride from the night before, even as a pang of hunger reminded him that he'd given away his share of dinner. Shaking off the chill, he got up and went to check on his grandma, who was already sipping her tea at the small kitchen table. "Good morning, Marcus," she greeted with a warm smile. "How did you sleep?" "Good," Marcus lied, returning the smile. Before he could grab his coat to head out for errands, a low rumbling sound caught his attention. It wasn't the familiar hum of the city buses or the clatter of delivery trucks. It was deeper, smoother, a car engine, but not just any car. Curious, Marcus peeked out through the cracked window. His eyes widened at the sight. Parked in front of their run-down apartment building was a sleek black car that gleamed in the morning sun, completely out of place in their shabby neighborhood. The chrome accents sparkled like jewels, and the tinted windows gave off an air of mystery. As Marcus squinted at the scene, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a sharp gray suit that fit him perfectly. His polished shoes clicked softly against the pavement as he adjusted his tie and glanced up at the building. Marcus froze. It couldn't be. But as the man stepped closer, the details became undeniable. The neatly combed hair, the clean-shaven face. It was him, the homeless man from last night. Marcus felt his heart pound as the man approached their door. He knocked firmly, his posture upright and composed. "Who is it?" his grandma called out, standing with effort. Marcus hurried to the door, his hand trembling slightly as he opened it. The man stood there, his sharp appearance almost surreal against the backdrop of their worn-out doorway. "Good morning," the man said in a deep, steady voice. He smiled softly, a glimmer of warmth in his eyes. "I'm Michael Carter. May I speak with you and your grandson?" Marcus's mouth went dry, his mind racing to connect the dots. He stammered. Michael nodded knowingly, his expression calm. "Yes, Marcus. I believe we met last night. You shared something very special with me. May I come in?" Marcus blinked, his thoughts spinning as he stepped aside, letting Michael in, still unable to fully process the strange turn his morning had taken. The small living room felt even smaller with Michael sitting there, his polished shoes resting on the frayed rug and his suit a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper behind him. Marcus and his grandmother sat across from him, their worn couch sagging slightly under their weight. Marcus couldn't take his eyes off Michael, still trying to reconcile the well-groomed man before him with the tired, ragged figure he'd met in the dark alley the night before. Michael sat quietly for a moment, his hands clasped together, as if searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but tinged with something deeper, regret, perhaps. "I wasn't always the man you saw last night," Michael began, glancing at Marcus with a faint smile. "In fact, for most of my life, I was someone entirely different." He paused, his gaze drifting to the chipped coffee table between them. I used to be a successful entrepreneur in the tech industry. I built a company from the ground up, and by the time I was 35, I was a millionaire. My wife, Laura, and our little boy, Ethan, were everything to me. Life was perfect. Or at least, I thought it was. Marcus noticed Michael's hands tighten slightly, his knuckles whitening as he continued. 3 years ago, everything changed. I was driving us home from a family vacation. It was late, and I was tired, but I insisted we push through to get home. I didn't see the other car in time. Michael's voice broke, and he exhaled shakily, his eyes glistening. Laura and Ethan didn't survive the crash, but I did. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the old refrigerator. Marcus's grandmother gently placed a hand over her mouth, her expression a mix of shock and sympathy. Marcus felt his chest tighten, the weight of Michael's story pressing down on him. I blame myself, Michael continued, his voice quieter now. I spiraled. I couldn't look at my house, my work, my life. Everything reminded me of what I'd lost. Eventually, I left it all behind. My company, my money, everything. I started living on the streets, not because I had to, but because I felt like I deserved it. He looked up, his gaze meeting Marcus's. For years, I wandered, searching for something, anything, that could make me feel human again. I started dressing like this. He gestured toward the doorway, referencing the worn clothes he'd shed that morning, to see if kindness still existed in the world, if someone, anyone could see me for more than just the wreck I'd become. Michael leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. Last night, Marcus, you did just that. You gave me something far more valuable than a meal. You gave me hope. Marcus's eyes widened as Michael smiled, the warmth in his face unmistakable. You reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there are people like you, people who care. And for the first time in years, I believe there's a reason to try again. The room fell silent, the weight of Michael's words settling like a gentle but profound wave. Marcus felt something stir deep inside him, a mixture of awe and pride he'd never known before. The room remained silent for a long moment after Michael finished his story. Marcus and his grandmother sat still, processing the weight of what they had just heard. The man who had seemed so lost and forgotten the night before was, in reality, someone who had lost everything, and now found a glimmer of hope through an act of kindness. Michael straightened in his chair, his voice soft but resolute. Marcus, Mrs. Eleanor, he began, addressing them both. Last night reminded me of the person I used to be, the person I want to be again. And I realized that if someone like Marcus with so little could still give so much, then I have no excuse not to do the same. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he looked earnestly at them. I want to help you. Marcus blinked, his heart skipping a beat. Help us? How? He asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael's smile was gentle but determined. Let me start by taking care of your grandmother's medical expenses. Mrs. Eleanor, I can see how much Marcus loves you and how hard he works to help you. You shouldn't have to worry about paying for treatments or medication anymore. I'll cover everything. Eleanor gasped softly, her hand going to her chest. Oh, Mr. Carter? That's too much, she stammered, her voice trembling. We couldn't possibly. Michael raised a hand, his expression warm but firm. Please, let me finish. That's just the beginning. Marcus, you're a bright, hardworking young man, and you deserve every opportunity to succeed. I want to fund your education, starting with a scholarship that will cover all your school expenses, books, supplies, everything. Marcus's jaw dropped, his mind racing. A scholarship? His dreams of going to college, which had always seemed so far out of reach, suddenly felt possible. And one more thing, Michael continued, glancing around the small, weathered living room. This house, it's your home, but it needs some work. Let me help renovate it, fix the leaks, patch the walls, and make it a place where you and your grandmother can feel safe and comfortable. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she covered her mouth with one hand as her other reached for Marcus's arm. This is more than we could ever dream of, she whispered, her voice cracking. Why would you do this for us? Michael's gaze softened as he looked at her and then at Marcus. Because last night, Marcus gave me something I can never repay, a reason to believe in people again. I want to honor that by helping your family. You've both already given me more than you realize. The room was quiet as Marcus and his grandmother exchanged a glance. Eleanor's eyes reflected a mix of gratitude and hesitation, while Marcus's mind buzzed with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, Michael's offer was a chance to change their lives, a way to ease his grandmother's struggles and finally chase his own dreams. But on the other, it felt overwhelming, even unbelievable. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Mr. Carter," he began cautiously, it's so generous. We're not used to taking help like this. I mean, it's a lot. Are you sure?" Michael smiled, his eyes steady. "I've never been more sure of anything. This isn't charity, Marcus. It's gratitude, and I want to do this. Not just for you, but because it's the right thing to do." Eleanor wiped her eyes, her voice steady despite her emotions. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "We'll need some time to think about this, but your kindness means more than I can say." Michael nodded, understanding their hesitation. "Take all the time you need," he said warmly. "I'm here whenever you're ready." As Michael stood to leave, Marcus and Eleanor walked him to the door, still grappling with the enormity of his offer. The man who had arrived as a stranger now left as something far more, a symbol of hope, and a promise of better days to come. The hours after Michael left were filled with quiet contemplation. Marcus and his grandmother sat together at the kitchen table, the warmth of their modest heater doing little to counter the chill of their thoughts. The glass jar labeled bills and groceries sat between them, half filled with loose change and a few crumpled dollar bills, a stark reminder of the reality they faced every day. Eleanor broke the silence first. "What do you think, Marcus?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. It's not something we ever imagined, but it could change everything." Marcus looked at her, his young face etched with a maturity far beyond his years. "I don't know, Grandma," he admitted honestly. "It feels strange. I mean, why us? Why would someone like him care about people like us?" Eleanor reached out, placing her hand over his. Her fingers were frail but steady. "Sometimes, Marcus, life surprises us. Kindness has a way of finding those who need it most. But it's okay to be cautious. It's okay to want to be sure." Marcus nodded, his brow furrowed. "I don't want to feel like we're just taking a handout, Grandma. You always taught me to work for what we have." "And you've done that, my boy," Eleanor said, her voice firm with pride. "You've worked harder than most grown men I know, but there's no shame in accepting help when it's given with a genuine heart. Mr. Carter isn't just offering charity. He's offering gratitude for the kindness you showed him." Marcus fell silent, staring at the jar on the table. He thought about his grandmother's medical bills, the damp spot on the ceiling of his room, the tattered books he used at school. Then he thought of Michael's words. "This isn't charity, it's gratitude." The next morning, Marcus made his decision. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think we should accept Mr. Carter's help, but I want to do my part too. I don't want to rely on him forever." Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's my Marcus," she said, grateful but determined. "I know you'll make the most of this." When they called Michael later that day, Marcus spoke clearly and confidently. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. We'd like to accept your help, but I promise I'll keep working hard to make things better for us too." Michael's voice on the other end of the line was warm and steady. "That's all I could ever ask, Marcus. Let's get started." The changes began almost immediately after Marcus and his grandmother accepted Michael's help. It started with a trip to the doctor's office, a place Eleanor hadn't been to in years, except for emergencies. Michael had arranged everything, insisting that Eleanor see the best specialists in the city. Marcus sat beside his grandmother in the waiting room, holding her hand tightly. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the clinic. "To finally be here, knowing it's all taken care of." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. He watched as the doctors and nurses greeted his grandmother warmly, running tests and prescribing treatments she had long delayed due to their cost. For the first time in years, Eleanor left the clinic with a plan, a path to managing her arthritis and regaining her strength. Michael didn't stop there. A few days later, workers arrived at their small weathered apartment. At first, Marcus couldn't believe it. They patched up the leaky roof, replaced the peeling wallpaper, and repaired the creaking floorboards. New windows were installed, letting in more light, and fresh paint transformed the space into a brighter, warmer home. The kitchen, once barely functional, was fitted with new appliances, and the damp smell that had lingered for years disappeared. Marcus watched in awe as their small world transformed before his eyes. It wasn't extravagant or overdone. It was simply comfortable, safe, and clean. For the first time, their home truly felt like a haven. Eleanor was speechless when she saw the changes. "I never thought I'd live to see this," she said, her voice trembling as she ran her fingers along the smooth, freshly painted walls. She turned to Michael, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." Michael simply smiled. "You deserve this, Mrs. Eleanor. Both of you do." With their home and Eleanor's health finally on stable ground, Marcus found himself in a position he hadn't experienced before, free to focus on his future. He no longer had to spend every afternoon working odd jobs just to scrape by. Instead, he threw himself into his studies, determined to make the most of the scholarship Michael had provided. At school, Marcus's teachers noticed the change almost immediately. He began raising his hand more often, his assignments grew more detailed, and his confidence blossomed. He even started participating in extracurricular activities, something he'd always dreamed of but never had the time for. Marcus joined the science club, where he discovered a love for building and experimenting. And he became a regular at the school library, devouring books on engineering and problem solving. On weekends, Marcus and his grandmother would sit together in their now cozy living room, going over his schoolwork and dreaming about what the future might hold. "Maybe one day I can build things that help people," Marcus said one evening, his eyes alight with excitement. "Like Mr. Carter does." Eleanor smiled, her heart full. "You can do anything you set your mind to, Marcus." But it wasn't just their physical circumstances that changed. It was their sense of hope. For years, life had been about survival, about scraping by and enduring each day. Now, with Michael's support, they could finally look ahead. They could dream. Marcus still worked when he could, but not out of necessity. It was out of habit, a way to show that he wasn't taking anything for granted. He'd save his small earnings in a new jar labeled Dreams and Plans, thinking of the possibilities that lay ahead. Their new life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus and Eleanor felt something they hadn't dared to feel in years, a sense of security and the freedom to hope for more. Life in Marcus's neighborhood didn't change as quickly as his own. The cracked sidewalks, peeling paint, and faint smell of dampness still defined the streets he walked every day. But for Marcus, things felt different now. His grandmother's health was improving, their once shabby apartment was warm and inviting, and he could focus on his studies without the constant weight of financial worry. To Marcus, it felt like hope had finally found its way into their lives. But not everyone in the neighborhood saw it that way. At first, the changes in Marcus's life drew curiosity. Neighbors whispered to each other as they saw the workers fixing up their home or Michael's sleek car parked outside. "Did you see that man in the suit again?" someone would say. "What's he doing for them?" Some were genuinely happy for Marcus and his grandmother, nodding approvingly when they passed by. But others weren't as kind. "I wonder how they managed to get all that," Mrs. Talbot from 2 doors down muttered one afternoon. "People like us don't just get handed fancy renovations and new appliances." "Probably some scam," another neighbor chimed in, shaking his head. "You can't trust people who come out of nowhere with money like that." Marcus started noticing the looks, glances that lingered a little too long, eyes that darted away when he caught them staring. At school, it wasn't much better. Kids who used to ignore him now whispered behind his back or asked prying questions. "So, you're rich now, huh?" one boy sneered in the hallway. "Guess it must be nice having some rich guy pay your bills." Marcus clenched his fists, his face burning with embarrassment and anger. He hated the way they looked at him, like he hadn't earned any of it, like he didn't deserve it. That evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his grandmother, pushing his dinner around on his plate. Eleanor noticed his silence and reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "What's bothering you, Marcus?" He hesitated, then sighed. "It's the neighbors and the kids at school. They think we don't deserve what Mr. Carter did for us. They think we didn't earn it." Eleanor's eyes softened, and she gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. Marcus, listen to me. People will always talk, especially when they don't understand something. But you know the truth. You know how hard we've worked, how much we've been through, and so does Mr. Carter. Marcus nodded, though his frustration lingered. But it's hard, Grandma. It's like no matter what I do, they'll always see me as the kid who got lucky. Eleanor smiled gently. Maybe they will. But Marcus, what matters is how you see yourself. You've always been kind, hardworking, and honest. That's who you are, and no one's opinion can change that. The next day at school, Marcus walked through the hallways with his head held higher. When the boy from before made another snide comment, Marcus paused, then turned to face him. You know, Marcus said evenly, kindness is free. You should try it sometime. The boy stared at him, speechless, as Marcus walked away. That evening, he helped his grandmother water the small flowers they'd planted in their newly fixed-up window box. For the first time, he felt at peace with letting people think what they wanted. Marcus realized that their opinions didn't matter as much as the truth he carried in his heart. As Michael watched Marcus and his grandmother rebuild their lives, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Yet, deep down, he knew there was more he could do. The streets he had wandered for years were still filled with people like him, people who had lost their way, their homes, and often their hope. Marcus's kindness had reminded him of the power of connection, and now Michael was determined to pay it forward on a larger scale. Michael began by reaching out to local organizations that worked with the homeless. He spent hours in meetings with directors of shelters, advocates for affordable housing, and community leaders. At first, some were skeptical of his intentions, but his passion and firsthand understanding of life on the streets quickly won them over. Michael shared his vision, a series of initiatives aimed at not just providing temporary relief, but creating lasting solutions. One of his first projects was building affordable housing for those without homes. Using his network of former business partners and leveraging his financial resources, Michael partnered with architects, contractors, and city officials to design housing complexes that were simple, sustainable, and most importantly, accessible. These weren't just buildings. They were places where people could feel safe and start anew. Michael named the project Haven Homes, reflecting his belief that everyone deserved a place to call their own. Construction began in the neighborhoods he had once walked through in despair. Seeing the framework of the first complex rise from the ground filled Michael with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. But he didn't stop at housing. Michael collaborated with community centers to establish vocational training programs, teaching skills that could help people re-enter the workforce. He also funded mental health and addiction recovery services, recognizing that many needed more than just a roof over their heads. They needed a path to reclaim their lives. Despite his busy schedule, Michael stayed connected to Marcus and Eleanor. He often visited them, seeking their perspective and encouragement. During one visit, Marcus asked, "Mr. Carter, why are you doing all this? You've already done so much for us." Michael smiled, his expression thoughtful. Because kindness isn't something you give once and forget. It's something you keep sharing, like ripples in a pond. You started something, Marcus, and I want to keep it going. Word of Michael's work spread throughout the city, drawing attention from local media and inspiring others to contribute. Donations poured in, and volunteers lined up to join his efforts. Michael was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was someone building something bigger than himself, a testament to what hope and determination could achieve. One day, as Michael stood before a crowd at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first Haven Homes complex, he thought about how far he had come. Looking out at the faces of those who would soon move in, families, veterans, individuals struggling to find stability, he felt a swell of emotion. This was more than a project. It was a promise that no one should feel forgotten. And in the crowd, standing with his grandmother, Marcus watched with pride, knowing that a small act of kindness had sparked a transformation far greater than he ever imagined. The help he and his grandmother had received from Michael had changed everything, not just their home, but their outlook on what was possible. And now, Marcus wanted to be that same spark of hope for others. It started small. At school, Marcus joined the Community Outreach Club, a group he had never even considered before, because his time was always consumed with work. Their first project was a food drive for the local shelter, and Marcus eagerly volunteered to help. He spent his weekends knocking on doors in the neighborhood, explaining their mission and collecting donations. "Did you know there are kids in our own school who don't have enough to eat?" he told his classmates, his voice steady and passionate. "We can change that. Even small things make a difference." Marcus's sincerity was contagious. By the end of the month, they had collected hundreds of cans of food, enough to fill the shelves of the shelter for weeks. The shelter manager thanked Marcus personally, saying, "You're a natural leader, son. Keep this up and you'll inspire even more people." Encouraged, Marcus began looking for other ways to give back. He volunteered at the library, tutoring younger kids who were struggling with their homework. He helped organize a cleanup day for the park near his school, rallying his friends and classmates to pitch in. Slowly, Marcus became known as the kid who always showed up, always ready to lend a hand. But it wasn't just about the work. Marcus also shared his story, speaking at school assemblies and neighborhood meetings. He talked about how one act of kindness, giving away a meal to a homeless man, had changed not only that man's life but his own. "You never know how far one small gesture can go," he told his peers. "It might seem like nothing to you, but to someone else, it could mean everything." His words resonated. Kids who had once teased Marcus now looked up to him, inspired by his journey. They began to see him not as the quiet boy from the struggling family, but as someone who believed in the power of kindness and acted on it. Marcus's grandmother watched his transformation with pride. "You're becoming a fine young man," she told him one evening as they sat together in their newly renovated living room. "But more than that, you're giving people something precious, hope." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling at her words. "I'm just trying to do what Mr. Carter did for us," he said. "He showed me that kindness doesn't have to stop with one person." The ripple effect of Marcus's actions began to spread throughout the community. His classmates started their own initiatives, organizing clothing drives and fundraising events for local charities. Neighbors who had once been skeptical of Marcus and his family now joined in, inspired by his determination to make a difference. One day, as Marcus walked home from school, he spotted a younger boy struggling to carry a heavy bag of groceries. Without hesitation, Marcus ran over to help. The boy looked up at him, wide-eyed. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "Because someone helped me once," Marcus replied with a smile, "and I want to keep it going." That simple answer summed up everything Marcus had learned. He understood now that kindness wasn't about grand gestures or recognition. It was about showing up, paying it forward, and believing in the potential for good in every person. As Marcus grew, so did his impact. What began as a single act of compassion had blossomed into a life dedicated to service. And through it all, he carried the memory of that cold night on the street when he gave away a meal and unknowingly set off a chain reaction of hope. Marcus knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was building a future, one kind act at a time. For Michael, the journey of rebuilding his life wasn't just about his own redemption. It was about creating something larger, something that could reach others who felt as lost as he once had. Every time he visited Marcus and Eleanor, he saw the ripple effects of what hope could do. Their smiles, their laughter, and the lightness in their steps reminded him that change was possible, even in the most difficult circumstances. But it wasn't just Marcus and Eleanor who benefited from his transformation. Through his foundation, Hope Renewed, Michael was now impacting hundreds of lives across the city. He spent his mornings meeting with architects, contractors, and city officials to expand his affordable housing initiative. Each new project brought him closer to his goal of ensuring that no one had to sleep on the streets if they didn't want to. As more housing units were completed, Michael made it a point to personally visit the families moving in, often sitting down to hear their stories. One woman, a single mother of two, hugged Michael tightly when he handed her the keys to her new apartment. "You don't know what this means to us," she said, tears streaming down her face. "For the first time, I feel like my kids have a future." Her words stayed with Michael. He reflected on how far he had come, from a man consumed by grief and guilt to someone who could genuinely offer hope. Each person he helped reminded him that life's meaning wasn't found in wealth or success, but in connection, compassion, and the chance to make a difference. In the afternoons, Michael dedicated time to speaking at schools, shelters, and community centers. His message was simple but powerful. Hope isn't lost. Sometimes it's just waiting for someone to light the way. He often shared the story of Marcus, describing how a young boy's small act of kindness had inspired him to reclaim his life. Michael also worked tirelessly to expand the foundation's reach. He collaborated with mental health professionals, addiction recovery specialists, and vocational training programs to provide holistic support to those in need. A roof over your head is just the beginning, he told his team. People need tools to rebuild their lives, just like I did. Though his days were full, Michael always made time to reflect. On quiet evenings, he often found himself walking through the neighborhoods where he once wandered aimlessly. Now, those same streets were lined with signs of change. Families moving into renovated homes, children playing in newly cleaned up parks, and community centers bustling with activity. One night, as he passed by the shelter where Marcus had volunteered, Michael spotted a mural painted on the side of the building. It depicted a young boy handing a meal to a homeless man, surrounded by bright, hopeful colors. At the bottom were the words, "Kindness starts with one." Michael stood there for a long time, taking it all in. He thought about Marcus, about the countless others who had stepped forward to join this movement of compassion, and about his own family, Laura and Ethan. He felt their presence, not in sorrow, but in a quiet, comforting sense of pride. In helping others, Michael had found a way to honor their memory and give his life purpose again. The pain was still there, but it was no longer the center of his world. Instead, it was a reminder of how precious life was, and how even the smallest act of kindness could ripple outwards, creating waves of change. As he walked home that night, Michael felt a deep sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would continue this work, bringing hope to as many people as he could. Because in giving others a chance to rebuild, he had also rebuilt himself. The aroma of Eleanor's famous vegetable stew filled the cozy kitchen as the Thompson family sat around the dining table. The once-worn room, with its patched-up walls and leaky ceiling, now glowed with the warmth of fresh paint and the soft hum of new lighting. The tiny apartment had become a sanctuary, a symbol of the hope and transformation that had entered their lives. Marcus, now confident and full of energy, sat beside his grandmother, listening intently as she shared stories from her youth. Her laughter was light and infectious, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. For the first time in years, the weight of worry had lifted from her shoulders, and it showed in her vibrant smile. "Back when I was your age, Marcus," Eleanor said with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, "I used to dream of traveling the world, Paris, London, you name it. I wanted to see it all." Marcus grinned. "Well, maybe we can make that happen someday, Grandma." "Who says dreams have to stay in the past?" Eleanor chuckled, reaching out to pat his hand. "You're such a good boy, Marcus. With that determination, I know you'll make all your dreams come true." The conversation turned to Marcus's plans for the future. He spoke excitedly about his school projects, his involvement in community activities, and his newfound love for engineering. "One day," he said, his eyes shining with ambition, "I want to build things that make a difference, like homes for people who need them, or machines that can help others." His grandmother nodded, her expression filled with pride. "And you will, Marcus. I believe in you." As the evening wore on, their laughter and voices filled the small home, a sharp contrast to the silence and struggle that had once defined their lives. Marcus couldn't help but think of Michael, whose generosity had sparked this change. But most of all, he thought about the moment that had started it all, sharing a simple meal with a man in need. He realized then how powerful small acts of kindness could be. That single moment of compassion had not only changed Michael's life, but had set into motion a transformation that rippled outward, touching countless others. As Marcus helped his grandmother clear the dishes, he made a quiet vow to himself to never stop being that spark for others. Because if one small act could create so much good, He could only imagine what a lifetime of kindness might do. And with that thought, Marcus looked toward the future, ready to embrace it with open arms and an open heart. This story reminds us that even the smallest acts of kindness can create waves of change. Marcus's selflessness and Michael's transformation show us the power of compassion, hope, and redemption. Together, they prove that no matter how dark life may seem, a single spark of generosity can light the way to a brighter future, for ourselves and for those around us. Let this be a call to action, to give, to hope, and to believe in the extraordinary impact of simple kindness. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of kindness, hope, and transformation. Let's keep spreading positivity and showing the world how small acts can make a big difference. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey of making the world a better place, one story at a time.